Good morning. Welcome to our Clean Cars Minnesota Rulemaking Information Session. I'm Maggie Winger. I'm an Air Policy Planner at the MPCA. During today's virtual meeting, we will have a video introduction by MPCA Commissioner Laura Bishop, followed by a presentation on the regulatory analysis for this rule. This is where we present information that supports why our state needs these rules and the benefits they would provide. Following the presentation, we will address questions from participants using a Q&A chat feature. Please note the rulemaking process has now entered a phase where interested persons need to share comments directly with an administrative law judge who is overseeing the process. People can submit comments to the judge directly by mail or through the eComments website, and also during online hearings that will be held in February. You will hear more information about all this later in the meeting. This meeting will be focused on providing you with information about the proposed rules and the opportunity to ask questions. There will be approximately 30 minutes for questions after the presentation. Note, you are able to turn on closed captioning by clicking on the little icon on the right side of your screen. Please keep in mind we cannot answer questions about enforcement or implementation at this time or questions related to any ongoing litigation. Thank you for coming, and we will get started now with comments from MPCA Commissioner Laura Bishop.
Pollution Control Agency's public information session about the Clean Cars Minnesota rulemaking. I'm Laura Bishop, MPCA Commissioner. Adopting clean car emission standards is critical in our work to protect against climate change, which is happening here and now with devastating effects seen and felt across our great state. The clean car standards have two goals. The first is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which is the leading cause of climate change. The second goal is to provide Minnesotans with more choices when purchasing cleaner electric and hybrid vehicles. Transportation is currently the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Minnesota, and light and medium duty vehicles, meaning the cars, trucks, and SUVs we drive each day, produce more than half of all transportation emissions in Minnesota. To address climate change, Minnesota has set ambitious goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Our goals are outlined in the Next Generation Energy Act, passed with bipartisan support in the Minnesota legislature and signed into law by Governor Tim Pawlenty in 2007. The act requires the state to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 15% by 2015, 30% by 2025, and 80% by 2050, all from a 2005 baseline. But so far, Minnesota is way off track. Emissions have only decreased by 8% overall since 2005. That means we missed our target in 2015. And at this rate, Minnesota is not on track to meet future goals either. In fact, data from recent years shows we're heading in the wrong direction, and emissions will continue to increase unless we take immediate action. We began the Clean Cars Minnesota effort in September 2019. Governor Tim Walz urged the agency to take action beyond federal vehicle emission standards and adopt the clean car standards that are used by more than a dozen states across the country, including Colorado, Maine, and Washington. Also in 2019, state agencies, including MPCA and the Minnesota Department of Transportation, had just wrapped up a major study of how to reduce emissions from transportation. According to public input gathered for the Pathways to Decarbonizing Transportation report, Minnesotans want and expect action from state leaders for cleaner, lower carbon transportation options, including adopting clean car standards. The proposed rule would allow Minnesota to adopt two vehicle emission standards that only apply to new vehicles for sale in our state. It would ensure Minnesotans who are shopping for a new vehicle will continue to have access to the cleanest cars, trucks, and SUVs available, and more electric vehicles to choose from. But this is just one part of a larger integrated strategy to build a cleaner, lower carbon transportation system here in Minnesota. To successfully reduce emissions, our state needs a multi-pronged approach that also includes building the necessary infrastructure for EVs, which means more charging stations around the state, supporting biofuels and other cleaner fuels, Community efforts to reduce emissions, like investing in transit and making biking and walking safer and more accessible. The MPCA is also leading work to address these other things. We are funding projects to build out the EV charging network across Minnesota. And another project is to replace old diesel burning school buses with electric models, which will reduce harmful emissions and protect students from pollution. Adopting the Clean Cars Minnesota rule is a practical strategy for reducing emissions and an important step to protect our communities, improve air quality, and support a healthy climate. I encourage you to visit our website to learn more about the proposed rule. Just go online and search Clean Cars Minnesota. Thank you for your interest in this rulemaking.
All right. We want to thank Commissioner Bishop for providing context for the proposed rules in our meeting today. A copy of this video is available on our MPCA Clean Cars Rulemaking website, where we have also saved a copy of the slides you will see in our presentation today. In addition, a recording of this entire virtual meeting, including the Q&A session, will be available on our website following the meeting. Before turning the meeting over to Amanda Smith, who will take us through the presentation, let's review guidelines for joining this virtual meeting and what you can expect as a participant. If you are joining this meeting on a smartphone, computer, or tablet using the link provided, you will hear the presenters speak and see any content they are sharing. You can submit questions during and after the presentation using the question and answer chat feature on the right hand of your screen. If the Q&A chat window is not open, select the Q&A icon in the top right corner, then type your question in the chat window. We will hold all questions until after the presentation. Remember, you can turn on closed captioning by clicking on the icon on the right side of your screen. If you're calling into the meeting using the phone number provided, you will hear presenters speaking, but you will not be able to ask questions during the presentation or see any slides or other content being shared. We will do our best to describe what appears on the slides, and when it comes time for the Q&A session, we will read the questions and our answers out loud. If you have access to the internet and would like to view the slides and follow along, open a browser window and search the phrase Clean Cars Minnesota Rulemaking. That should bring you to the right web page. Then scroll down to Public Information Sessions. A PDF file of these slides is available there. Please note all participants in the meeting will remain muted throughout. That means MPCA staff cannot hear you if you ask a question out loud. We will do our best to answer as many questions as we can during the allotted time, but please note we will not be able to answer certain types of questions. In addition, MPCA staff cannot take rulemaking comments during this information session. And now I would like to introduce Amanda Smith, who will take us through the presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Let me just get everything set up here. My name is Amanda Jarrett Smith. I'm the Climate and Energy Policy Planner at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and the project coordinator for this rulemaking. Thanks again for joining us today to learn more about the Clean Cars Minnesota rulemaking. In this presentation, I'm going to have three main parts. The first is to walk through the proposed Clean Cars Minnesota rule and the 2 emissions standards that we're proposing to adopt in this action. Then I'm going to give a brief overview of the MPCA's analysis of the proposed rule and its potential effects. And then finally, I'll cover how you can give feedback and participate in this part of the rulemaking. Immediately following the presentation, we'll have times for questions and answers with myself and other MPCA staff. And you can feel free to start inputting those questions now, and we'll address them as once the presentation concludes. So let's get started. The Clean Cars Minnesota rulemaking would enable the state to adopt 2 clean car standards, known as the Low Emission Vehicle Standard and the Zero Emission Vehicle Standard. The low emission vehicles are traditional cars, SUVs, and pickup trucks that run relatively cleanly on liquid fuels. Zero emission vehicles are powered by electricity and have no tailpipe emissions. As Commissioner Bishop introduced, these standards would work together to ensure Minnesotans shopping for new vehicles will have continued access to the cleanest models available and more options for electric vehicles. These standards have been adopted by a number of other states, including Colorado, Maine, and Washington, so we have seen them in action. We know the standards work, that vehicle manufacturers can comply with them successfully, and we have a community of other states to learn from that includes cold weather climates and rural communities. So this slide shows a map of the 14 states in the District of Columbia that have adopted the low emission vehicle standard. Nearly all have also adopted the zero emission vehicle standard. It also shows the 3 additional states that are currently in progress towards adopting these standards. Along with Minnesota, Nevada and New Mexico are currently working to adopt both clean car standards. All states that have adopted the clean car standards have done so through a similar rulemaking process like the one we're following here in Minnesota, except for Washington, D.C., which is not a state. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of the standards now. The first is the low emission vehicle standard, or LEV, which sets limits for tailpipe pollution for auto manufacturers, meaning it regulates the amount of greenhouse gases and other harmful air pollution that new vehicles can emit. This standard is nothing new. The auto industry has been successfully meeting the standard since 2012. LEV certified vehicles are already what's for sale in Minnesota lots. In fact, because the federal standard and the LEV standard were the same from 2012 until 2020, all new vehicles sold in Minnesota over the last 8 years have been LEV certified vehicles. Adopting the LEV standard now would preserve consumer access to these cleaner, more efficient vehicles that Minnesotans enjoy today. It's also important to note that the LEV standard becomes more stringent over time, which means it requires the auto industry to make incremental progress year over year in producing cleaner, lower emitting vehicles. The second standard is the zero emission vehicle standard, or ZEV, and it works slightly differently. It requires auto manufacturers to deliver more zero emission vehicles for sale in Minnesota, increasing each year. So here we're talking about battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. The exact number of vehicles is linked to the auto manufacturer's overall sales within the state. And like LEV, this standard also calls for incremental progress over time, not sudden overnight change. Right now, it is simply the case that there are more makes and models available in ZEV states that have adopted this rule, than we can easily acquire here. 2 examples that we hear about a lot are the Subaru Crosstrek Hybrid and the Kia Niro EV, electric SUV options that aren't offered in Minnesota currently. Automakers are investing billions of dollars in developing this technology and bringing new makes and models to the market. This slide includes an image of the Ford F-150 electric model, which is just one example among many of new electric SUVs, crossovers, and pickup trucks that are coming down the pike. In the past, we in Minnesota have been on the tail end of receiving new makes and models of electric vehicles, but we want to ensure that Minnesota is on the forefront of receiving this new innovation. And there's a potential knock-on effect too. More new EVs on the market here could lead to more used EVs becoming available in our secondary markets as well. So this slide lists some of the basic facts about the proposed Clean Cars Minnesota rule. It would apply to new light and medium duty vehicles only. It does not apply to off-road or heavy duty equipment or vehicles like farm equipment or semi-trucks. It does not apply to existing vehicles or used vehicles and does not require anyone to get rid of a vehicle they already own. It does not require emissions testing. The proposed rule does not require any individual to purchase an EV and does not eliminate popular vehicles like SUVs or pickup trucks. This slide shows the possible timeline for implementation if the proposed rule is approved by the administrative law judge and the MPCA completes the rulemaking process in 2021. The federal government would also need to restore California's waiver under the Federal Clean Air Act before implementation could begin. As the timeline illustrates in the green section, the Federal Clean Air Act requires a 2-year waiting period between adopting and implementing the Clean Car standards. This means that there is considerable time built in for auto manufacturers to plan and prepare before the standards would go into effect in Minnesota. The proposed rule would affect new vehicles for sale starting in model year 2025 or approximately January 2024 at the soonest. We are also proposing an early action credit system to encourage manufacturers to bring more electric vehicles to Minnesota even sooner. Earning early action credits would be optional for manufacturers, but would provide an incentive for them to ramp up their EV offerings before 2024. So as part of the rulemaking process, MPCA staff are required to conduct a thorough technical analysis of the potential effects of a proposed rule and share these results with the presiding administrative law judge and the public. This is called the Statement of Need and Reasonableness, or SONAR. In the next few slides, I will be walking through the results of this analysis, but if you'd like a deeper dive, you can access the full SONAR document on the MPCA's website. As we go through the results, I'll give page numbers from the SONAR where you can find more information. So as Commissioner Bishop introduced, the primary goal of this rulemaking is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation by making sure Minnesota consumers have access to cleaner traditional vehicles and more electric vehicles. The chart on this slide shows the annual well-to-wheel greenhouse gas emission reductions in the first 10 years of implementation, starting with model year 2025 and continuing through 2034. MPCA uses well-to-wheel emissions calculations to make sure that we are capturing the fullest picture of emissions and potential benefits. This means our analysis includes the emissions from vehicle tailpipes, as well as emissions from power plants used to generate electricity for powering electric vehicles, as well as the extraction, transportation, and processing of liquid fuels. You can find this chart and more information on page 77 of the SONAR. The MPCA's analysis estimates that the Clean Cars Minnesota rule would reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 8.4 million tons in the first 10 years of implementation. What starts as a modest emission reduction in model year 2025 grows into bigger and bigger benefits each year. By model year 2034, we estimate that the Clean Cars Minnesota rule would reduce 1.4 million tons of greenhouse gases in that year alone. This graph only shows the first 10 years of implementation, so it's important to note that the benefit will continue to grow for at least another decade beyond this time frame. The MPCA's analysis also indicates that the proposed rule would increase consumer choice for electric vehicles. Our analysis showed that EVs make up less than 0.3% of new vehicles on the lot for sale in Greater Minnesota, and less than 1% of new vehicles for sale on lots in the Twin Cities metropolitan area. That's not a lot of choices for consumers to consider when shopping for a new vehicle. Meanwhile, our analysis shows that dealers in cold weather ZEV states like Vermont, New York, and Connecticut are carrying higher numbers of electric vehicles in comparably sized communities, more like 1 to 3% of available vehicles for sale. The numbers here are still not large, but they do indicate that dealers in ZEV states are, with similar climates to Minnesota, are carrying a higher percentage of EVs on their lots, including in smaller towns. You can find more information about EV availability on page 49 of the SONAR. Next, the MPCA's analysis demonstrates that the proposed rule would protect human health by reducing community exposure to harmful air pollution from vehicles. Specifically, we estimate that Clean Cars Minnesota would reduce more than 6,000 tons of non-methane organic gases and nitrogen oxides, and over 3,000 tons of particle pollution in the first 10 years of implementation alone. This rule would prevent hundreds of premature deaths from respiratory and cardiovascular health effects of air pollution during that same time period. And the economic value of these avoided deaths and other negative health impacts may be as high as $3.2 billion. You can find more information about the potential health benefits of the rule on page 79 of the SONAR. The MPCA's analysis also looked at the equity impacts of the proposed rule. Our equity analysis can be found starting on page 83 of the SONAR. Currently, lower income communities and communities of color in Minnesota are exposed to higher levels of vehicle pollution due to a history of discriminatory and racist policies and practices in urban planning, housing, and highway design. Our analysis indicates that these overburdened communities would see the greatest air quality benefits from the proposed rule. This slide includes a chart showing which geographic areas specifically would see the largest reductions in harmful air pollution from implementing the Clean Cars rule. PM 2.5 is fine particle pollution, which is a primary pollutant from vehicles that impacts human health. The dashed line on the chart, running horizontally, indicates the estimated average pollution reductions we'd expect to see across the entire state. On your far left, you can see that the largest estimated pollution reductions would be seen in what's labeled as EJ areas BIPOC. BIPOC is an acronym that stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. So what this means is that the largest estimated pollution reductions will be in those areas that the MPCA identifies as areas of concern for environmental justice, specifically those with higher concentrations of Black and Indigenous residents and people of color. In the middle, you'll see that low-income areas will also see a larger air quality benefit than the statewide average. On the far right, you'll see that tribal areas are lower. This is because they are mostly rural and therefore experience lower vehicle-related emissions to begin with. While the proposed Clean Cars Minnesota rule would not entirely eliminate existing air quality disparities in Minnesota, it is an important step towards reducing them. The clear air quality benefits for some of our most overburdened communities. Finally, I want to cover what the MPCA's analysis found in terms of potential costs and benefits for consumers who purchase a new vehicle after the Clean Car standards have been implemented. First, let's cover the basics for consumers looking to buy a new LEV certified vehicle. As I introduced earlier, LEV certified vehicles are already what's for sale in Minnesota dealerships, and it's what's been for sale here in Minnesota for the last 8 years. However, a potential cost difference could occur if in the future auto manufacturers begin producing models two different models, one cleaner, more efficient model for LEV states and one higher emitting model for non-LEV states. The MPCA analyzed the potential impact of consumers for this possible price difference and found that there is a negligible difference in terms of cost or benefit for most consumers. Essentially, the potential higher upfront cost of a LEV certified vehicle would be made up for over time due to fuel savings. When it comes to purchasing a new electric vehicle, the benefits are even clearer. There is a clear consumer benefit based on savings related to fuel and maintenance. And studies indicate that battery costs are continuing to decline, so the financial benefit of a battery electric vehicle is expected to grow over time. Lastly, MPCA's analysis also explored possible impacts to traditional vehicle availability. In all but one of the states that have adopted Clean Car standards, the most popular vehicle model is an SUV or a pickup truck. This indicates that the availability of traditional trucks and SUVs has not been negatively affected by auto manufacturers delivering more electric vehicles for sale. And consumers in Clean Car states continue to have access to all types of vehicles. All right, so we've reached the final section. In my last few slides, I'm going to walk through the next steps in the rulemaking process and how you can participate. As a reminder, if you're participating via smartphone, computer, or tablet, you can submit questions you have for MPCA staff at any time using the question and answer chat feature on the right side of your screen. If that window is not open, select the Q&A icon at the top right corner, then type your question in the chat window. You can submit your questions at any point, and we will begin answering the questions after the presentation. So this slide provides an overview of where we are currently in the rulemaking process. In December 2020, the MPCA published the official Notice of Intent to Adopt rule with a hearing in the State Register and on our website. I recommend everyone read the full Notice of Intent and review all of the information it contains. The notice and all supporting documents are published on our website, including the proposed rule language and the sonar we discussed here today. To find this page, go online and search for Clean Cars Minnesota Rulemaking, and this page would appear at the top of your search results. When the notice was published, a new comment period opened, which gives Minnesotans another opportunity to weigh in. During this comment period, all questions, comments, and feedback should be submitted directly to the administrative law judge assigned to this rulemaking. In February, the presiding administrative law judge, Judge Jessica Palmer-Denig, will hold a public hearing on February 22nd and 23rd, beginning at 3 p.m. both days. Attending this hearing is one opportunity for you to submit questions or comments before the judge. In a bit, we'll share additional ways for you to submit your comments. Please note that the comment period will close on March 15th. When the comment period closes, you will also have an opportunity to read and respond to the comments that others have submitted. This is what's known as the rebuttal period. More information about the rebuttal period is available on the Office of Administrative Hearings website, which we'll cover in the next slide. After the comment period closes, the ALJ will consider the materials submitted by the agency along with your comments and later issue a decision on whether MPCA may adopt the proposed rule. If you would like to propose changes to the rule, ask a question, or otherwise submit your views about the Clean Cars Minnesota rule, there are two possible methods for you to choose from. Regardless of which method you choose, your feedback will be considered equally, and you can choose one or both of the methods that we'll talk about here. This slide shows the first method, which is to put your comment into writing and submit it directly to Judge Palmer-Denig. You can submit your comment online using the Office of Administrative Hearings Rulemaking e-comments website. The direct link is posted here and on the MPCA's website. For step-by-step instructions, search Minnesota Rulemaking Comments website. The OAH website should appear at the top of your results. The image at the right on the slide shows what that web page should look like. From here, you can access instructions for how to use the e-comments website as well as their FAQ. You are strongly encouraged to submit written comments to the ALJ through this website. But if that is not possible for you, you can submit your written comments in person, via US mail, or by fax to Judge Palmer-Denig using the instructions in the public notice. And an important reminder, all written comments must be submitted to the ALJ. If you submit comments to the MPCA instead, it will not be part of the rulemaking record. So this slide shows the second method, which is to attend a public hearing online in February and ask your questions, share your suggested changes, or voice your opinions there. This is what is referred to as giving testimony at the hearing. The hearings will start at 3 p.m. and go till at least 6 p.m. each day. The public hearings will be held online only using WebEx, so there is no opportunity to participate in person. Links to join the public hearing are available in the public notice. To participate in the public hearings, you will need access to a smartphone, computer, or tablet with an internet connection and a microphone or headset if you would like to speak. You can also choose to just watch the proceeding. Right now, the WebEx links provided in the public notice are the only confirmed method for how you can participate in the hearing. We are still working with the Office of Administrative Hearings to determine whether an option for a call-in by phone will work with the hearing process. When we have more information on that, we will post additional details on the rulemaking webpage. And so with that, thank you for joining us today. We're now going to begin the question and answer portion of our session today. As a reminder, if you're participating via smartphone, computer, or tablet, you can submit questions you have for MPCA staff using the question and answer chat feature at the right side of your screen. If the chat box is not already open, select the Q&A icon at the top right corner and then type your question and submit.
All right, thank you. A lot of people have already submitted questions, so we're going to get to as many as we can. And as Amanda said, we may combine some on similar topics so we can cover as much ground as possible. There was one question I just want to note for everyone. The other information sessions scheduled this week and in the coming weeks will cover the same material. You're welcome to attend as many as you wish, but it will be the same presentation. So the first question we have is from Sean Hanna. In the 18 years since California adopted its own clean car standards, it still has the highest, worst pollution in the country, while Minnesota is one of the cleanest air states. Since California has failed to actually create a clean air state, why would Minnesota want to model after California? We have several other questions in the queue about the relationship between this rule and the California standards.
All right, great. Thank you. That's a great question. So here in Minnesota, we have our own air quality and climate goals and that we are trying to achieve. And so we analyzed what this rule might do here in Minnesota to help us achieve those goals. And those were the things that I outlined in the presentation. So, California has its own special, unique circumstances in terms of air pollution and kind of the circulation of weather and things like that. But what we've done is analyze whether or not these rules would benefit Minnesota, and our analysis found that they would. And so that's why we're proposing to adopt the standards here.
All right, we also got a question about future California standards. California is pursuing additional rulemaking or initiating additional rulemaking. How would that affect this rule, or did we consider that in developing this rule?
Yeah, another great question. So what we are doing today is proposing to adopt the standards as they exist today. So those are standards through model year 2025. If California chooses to adopt new standards beyond model year 2025, we would need to analyze those standards and determine whether or not they make sense for Minnesota, and then choose to either continue to follow the California standards or return to using federal standards. Either way, it would require a rulemaking process, and there would be an additional analysis like the one we've outlined here, and we would have a new public comment period. So I just want to emphasize that what we're doing here is proposing to adopt the standards as they exist today, not any future standards that would require a separate and potentially future process.
All right. We also have multiple questions on the process for this rule and why it did not go through the legislature.
All right, great questions, lots of great questions. So in Minnesota and other states, the state legislature gives agencies authorities to adopt rules under kind of their area of expertise. So in Minnesota, the state legislature gave the MPCA the authority to adopt rules related to air pollution, specifically including motor vehicle pollution. So we are adopting these rules under those authorities given to us by the state legislature. Rulemaking is a standard process that state agencies go through on a regular basis. I also think that it's important to note that these are regulations under the Clean Air Act, and the MPCA is the authority in Minnesota for adopting rules related to the Clean Air Act. And all the other states that have adopted these rules have done so through rulemaking. So we're following a standard process that has been laid out for us by the state legislature and by the Clean Air Act, and we are doing so under those authorities that have been given to us by the Minnesota State Legislature and by the Clean Air Act.
All right, we have a other states information question. Since 11 of the 15 states using California's clean car rules have been in effect for at least 10 years, has Minnesota accumulated data on the success or failure of the strategy in their analysis? If so, where is this data? That's from Sean Hanna.
Great, thanks for that question. So we know that the vehicle manufacturers have been complying with these standards in these states since they've been adopted. So we have no reason to believe that they would not be able to comply with them here in Minnesota. And we have analyzed the air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions benefits that we anticipate here in Minnesota, and that's outlined in our documentation.
Okay, we have a question from Wally on, with the substantial reduction in miles driven in 2020, based on Governor Walz's lockdowns, what reduction have we seen in 2020 emission levels?
We don't have emission calculations here for 2020 yet. We did recently release a greenhouse gas inventory report that goes through 2018. That's the most current data that we have, but in the future we would have that data for 2020, but we don't have it available today.
We have some questions about the equity analysis. In the equity part, are the numbers for each category in percentiles? I think we might want to go back to that slide if we can.
Sure. I might ask my colleague David Bale, who is one of our analysts on this rulemaking, to try to answer that question, if you could, David.
Yes, thank you, Amanda. Good morning, everyone. I'm David Bale. I am an economic policy analyst at the MPCA, and I'm one of the people that did the regulatory analysis for this rule proposal. So good question. I think these are not percentile reductions. Rather, these are our estimates of the reduction of ambient PM 2.5 concentrations in the air that would result from this rule. So you can see, for example, that for the environmental justice areas identified because of their Black, Indigenous, and people of color, we predict that this rule will result in a reduction of 0.26 micrograms per cubic meter in their annual average PM 2.5 in those areas. So these are not percentiles, these are absolute reductions as a result of this rule. I hope that helps explain. Thank you.
Thanks, David.
All right, just a quick reminder, we have a lot of questions in the queue. We're going to get to as many as we can. We're going to try and focus on questions about the analysis. And if you have additional information that you can provide or you have a comment to make, please submit that to the e-comment site or at the hearing, as Amanda explained. So the next question is about, does the cost analysis account for lost gas tax revenue by electrification?
Another great question. So we did look at state revenue impacts in our analysis, and I think I'll refer this question to David again. David?
Yes, thank you again, Amanda. I agree, good question. So yes, as Amanda just stated, we did look at the impacts on state revenues that we expect as a result of this rule. One of the key impacts, as the questioner alluded to, is our state fuel taxes. With people buying and consuming less gasoline as a result of this rule, there will be less fuel tax revenue for the state. That is true. However, we found that those reduced fuel tax revenues are almost exactly offset by gains in revenues for the state, including gains in sales tax revenue, gains in annual registration tax revenues, gains in because currently battery electric vehicles in Minnesota owners have to pay a $75 annual premium on their registration. So there will be reduced fuel tax revenues for the state, but these are almost exactly offset by gains in other sources of state revenue. Thanks.
Thanks, David.
We have a lot of questions about impacts to dealers and reduced car sales. I'm trying to find one to publish. But concerns about overall reduced sales and impacts on auto dealers. So one from Scott Lambert, don't you believe there will be no air quality benefit if people can't afford the new price you are setting for the vehicle?
Well, we are not setting any new prices for vehicles. Those are set by vehicle manufacturers, not by the state. That said, we have not seen any clear evidence of what one might call a rebound effect, where vehicles are sold at a lower rate than because of upfront costs. But I think I'll maybe refer to David if he wants to talk a little bit about that part of our analysis. David, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. Yeah, I would just reiterate that yes, of course, that the manufacturers set the prices. It is true that if it costs more for manufacturers to produce cars to meet stricter regulations, then those additional costs to manufacturers will be passed on to purchasers, the consumers that purchase those vehicles. In our consumer analysis, we have estimated that for LEV certified cars will likely have on average a higher purchase cost than vehicles that just satisfy the current federal standards. However, we've also found that those increased purchase costs are generally offset for LEV certified vehicles by savings over time and reduced fuel costs. So we actually don't see that there is a severe kind of consumer impact of LEV in terms of direct impacts on Minnesotans' pocketbooks. And moreover, for the ZEV standard, we actually see a consumer benefit even with the current generally higher cost of electric vehicles, but that is made up, more than made up over time in fuel and maintenance savings. So we don't expect this rule to have a detrimental effect generally on Minnesota consumers. And in fact, we see considerable consumer benefits of electric vehicle ownership. I hope that answered the question. Feel free to follow up if you want more.
And I think I'll just add, our consumer cost benefit analysis is quite lengthy and detailed, and I'd encourage folks who are interested in it to take a look at our Statement of Need and Reasonableness, the SONAR, starting on page 71. And then we have a technical support document that outlines the details of our methodology that I'd encourage folks to explore as well.
All right, we have a question from Marlon. In the presentation, you said EVs have not affected the number of other popular vehicles offered for sale. If that is the case, why do we think that sale of electric vehicles would increase here?
So offering more electric vehicles for sale, especially, I think, well, let me go back to our slide here. So our analysis indicates that, there we go, that states that have adopted these standards do have more electric vehicles on offer for people who want to buy an electric vehicle. So as I mentioned, right now, there are certain makes and models that folks in Minnesota are not able to easily access here. There's also very few models on the lot for folks who might want to consider an EV among other options. So the intent here is to provide more options for folks who might want to purchase an electric vehicle. These numbers are still not huge, and so that means that folks who want to purchase a vehicle that is not an electric vehicle still have plenty of access to those types of vehicles as well.
All right, we have a couple questions about what is the current PM2.5 pollution level statewide in the Twin Cities. Are we meeting the federal standards? And if we're meeting the federal standards, how do we show any health impacts of reductions? I'll publish one, but there are several in the queue.
Great question. So we are currently meeting our standards for fine particle pollution here in Minnesota, but I think I'll again defer to David to provide a little bit more detailed answer to that question. David, do you have some thoughts?
Sure, I can provide a few comments. Thank you. So I think the questioner asked what is the current PM 2.5 or fine particles air quality standard, and that is 12 micrograms per cubic meter annual average PM 2.5. As Amanda said, currently all parts of Minnesota are in attainment of that standard. But I would say, and research tends to back this up, that just because we are in attainment of air quality standards does not mean that there are no effects of, or no health impacts of air pollution at levels below those standards. So based on epidemiological research, including that done by the EPA and its regulatory impact analyses, shows that there is significant evidence that there are still health impacts of these pollutants even at levels below the standards. Thus, we estimate that from reducing the levels of these pollutants in Minnesota's air, there will be health benefits, even though, again, we are in attainment of standards. Thanks.
All right. Are commercial vehicles included in the rule? If not, why?
So the rule is about low emission vehicles and, light duty vehicles and medium duty vehicles. And so that doesn't have to do with the use of the vehicle, it has to do with the size of the vehicle. So a light duty vehicle or a medium duty vehicle used for personal use or for business use are both regulated under the standard.
This is anonymous, but did the MPCA basically just copy what Colorado did with their rulemaking, and what differences were identified between Minnesota and Colorado?
Great question. So the Clean Air Act allows states to either use the federal standard or adopt these alternative standards. And if we adopt the alternative standards, we need to adopt them identically to what the other states who have these alternative standards have done. So the rule is very similar to what you would see in Colorado. The primary difference, though, is that we looked at, let me back up a little bit. The ZEV standard is implemented through a credit banking system. So vehicle manufacturers earn credits for different electric vehicles depending on the type of the vehicle and how far it can drive on a battery charge. And that is intended to give manufacturers flexibility for how they implement the rule and what makes sense for their fleet and vehicle options. States that adopt these standards are allowed to develop mechanisms to establish an initial bank of credits for manufacturers to make sure that those manufacturers have flexibility in the initial years of implementation. Colorado had one method for doing this, and the MPCA, after analyzing that potential method and a variety of others, we determined a different method would work best for us. So that is the main area of difference between our rule and what Colorado did.
All right, we have a few questions in the chat about electric vehicles in cold weather and whether we took this the drop in efficiency into account when calculating emissions and consumer benefits.
I think I'll defer to David on this question. David, do you have some thoughts to share?
Yeah, I'm sorry, could you repeat that question again, Maggie?
It was about we have a couple about just what EVs don't have the same range or efficiency in cold weather. How did we take that into account on the costs and benefits?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It might be a little bit outside the scope of what we did in our regulatory analysis, particularly for consumer impacts. Yes, undoubtedly that is a significant concern to consumers. Range issues, as Amanda mentioned in her presentation, that we are, concurrently working on expanding EV infrastructure to address some of these concerns. But we did not factor this into our consumer analysis. As Amanda also noted, the ZEV standard will not require anybody to purchase an EV if people feel that, given kind of the charging infrastructure that they have access to is unsatisfactory, they will not have to purchase an EV. But the short answer is we did not take into account range issues in looking at consumer impacts. We just looked at the direct financial impacts. Thanks.
Thanks, David.
All right, we have a couple questions on the process for the hearing. So, example, should parties sign up in advance to provide hearing testimony? Is there a time limit? Will the Office of Administrative Hearings provide information on their process or have a public info session of its own? So, Amanda, if you or Katie want to share some details on how the hearing will work.
Sure. I think I can take a first crack, and then I may call in our rulemaking coordinator here to help me out. So there are a lot of pieces to that. So the first is that no, the Office of Administrative Hearings will not be providing its own information session. That is what we're trying to provide here. We want to make sure that Minnesotans who are interested in this rulemaking understand how they can participate in it and provide comment. And so that's one of the core reasons why we're doing these information sessions, so that folks know how to participate. In terms of a time limit, that would be set by the administrative law judge, and that has not been determined yet. And let's see, what else was on that list of questions? Could someone prompt me? Was there another, or maybe it's in the chat here? Oh, do you have to sign up in advance? I do not believe so. Katie, could you help us with, do you need to sign up in advance to testify at the hearing?
Hi, we do not sign up in advance. The way the rule hearings work is that the judge assigns the order or takes people in the order they sign up as the hearing begins. They don't want there to be some sort of advantage for people who hear about it early or something. So yeah, no advance sign up, and the time limit will be determined by the judge at the hearing.
Thank you, Katie.
All right, I'm going to publish one from Julia Reggie, but there are several about this idea. The commissioner mentioned the need for a multi-pronged approach, including expanding infrastructure and biofuels. Has analysis been done to identify the amount of charging that needs to be available to support the level of EVs required by the rules?
We have not done that analysis, although there are lots of analyses that exist out there that look at the need for charging and in states and across the country. So we are working to grow the EV charging infrastructure here in Minnesota. MPCA has invested millions of dollars from the National Volkswagen Settlement Fund to expand infrastructure across greater Minnesota along highway corridors and in community uses as well. It's also not just the MPCA that's acting on this. So several utilities and communities are installing charging across the state as well. And so we know that we need to continue to grow our EV infrastructure in the state, and we are committed to doing that.
All right, we have a couple questions about how the benefits happen, or what benefits do rural areas see from this rulemaking? Would reduced emissions only affect the Twin Cities? Why are we applying this statewide? So I think in general, what's the geographic distribution of the benefits and costs?
Great question. So we cannot apply different vehicle emission standards to different parts of the state. The Clean Air Act allows states to either use the federal standards that the EPA writes, or we can use these alternative standards, but we have to use them statewide. We can't apply them differently in different places. So we're proposing to adopt these standards as a state. In terms of benefits of the rule, greenhouse gas emission reductions anywhere benefit the climate everywhere. And so I think that's an important piece to understand. And then in terms of air pollution that kind of more directly impacts human health, like fine particles and nitrogen oxides, those, we have busy highways all across the state, and those pollutants are most impactful to folks who live close to those busy highway corridors. And there are air pollution health impacts across our state. And maybe David might want to highlight a couple other thoughts on this topic as well. David, do you have anything you want to add?
Yes, thanks, Amanda. There's not much I would add to that. I certainly agree with the questioner that there will be larger, air quality benefits to as a result of this rule in more heavily populated areas. Of course, that does not apply to the greenhouse gas emissions, as Amanda just explained. Those benefits are the same wherever those emissions occur. And also, as Amanda said, we don't have the option to apply a different rule to one part of Minnesota and another to another part of Minnesota. So I'm not sure I added a whole lot, but those are some of my thoughts. Thanks.
Great, thanks, David. I would also encourage folks a little bit outside of this, but I would encourage folks who are interested in air pollution impacts in greater Minnesota and across our state. We have a report called the Life and Breath Report that was published, I believe, last year that looked at the health impacts of air pollution across Minnesota. And it is the fact that air pollution does not just affect the health of Minnesotans in the Twin Cities or other metropolitan areas, but across our state. And I encourage folks to take a look at that as well. Excuse me, what were you going to say, Maggie?
Oh, new question, so that's good.
Great.
Does the cost analysis account for loss of Minnesota oil and gas industry, including impacts of lost employment and tax revenue from shutting down oil refineries, terminals, pipelines, gas stations, etc.?
I think the short answer is that we did not factor in that level of detail on the oil and gas industry, but David, do you want to provide some thoughts?
Yes, thanks, Amanda. It's a great question. As Amanda mentioned, that was not the focus of our costs and benefits impacts. We looked at the costs and benefits to Minnesota consumers. However, we did give some attention. I can't remember which page of the sonar, but we did address that there would be potentially larger, more macroeconomic impacts of this rule. That is, impacts that are more widespread throughout Minnesota's economy. And as the questioner mentioned, I mean, one of the kind of subsectors of the Minnesota economy that could see impacts is the oil and gas sector. And there is the possibility that there will be negative effects on that sector of Minnesota's economy. However, there will also be positive impacts on other sectors in Minnesota economy, including the electricity sector, including the sectors involved with the building EV infrastructure. So there are many different kind of economic impacts. There will be some parts of the economy that gain and some that lose. But in our analysis, we focused on consumer impacts.
And I'll just add to that. So in the sonar, if you want to look at all the different cost benefit analyses that we put together, that all starts on page 68 of the sonar. If you want to look at the content that David just mentioned, let me find that for you. That can be found starting on page 75 of the sonar.
All right, we have another ALJ question. Will the administrative law judge adopt the rule as proposed, or might they change components like the credit banking?
So the administrative law judge, I guess just one point of clarification, the actor who adopts or does not adopt the standards would be the MPCA, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. The administrative law judge will tell us whether or not we are allowed to adopt the standard. They can also tell us if we need to change parts of the rule before adopting, or if they have recommendations for us for changing the rule before adopting. If Katie has anything she wants to add to that, I'd pause for a moment. Okay, sounds like not.
All right, I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll wrap up with instructions on how to submit a comment. So we have a couple questions in the queue about how does the new federal administration affect this rulemaking, and have we considered waiting or to see what happens with federal emission standards?
Great question. So there's a lot of uncertainty about what the new federal administration may or may not do. And what we want to do here is to adopt standards that we know exist and that we have analyzed for the costs and benefits here in Minnesota, and to provide some certainty going forward related to that. So we'll have to see what happens at the federal level, but adopting these standards allows us to know that at least in the near term, these are the standards that will apply here in Minnesota.
All right. We're at our time. Thank you everyone for participating in our meeting today. Again, for more information, go online and search for Clean Cars Minnesota Rulemaking. That will take you to our main rulemaking webpage. That's where you can find a copy of the presentation we heard today, as well as a recording of this entire presentation. Give us 24 hours on that. And Commissioner Bishop's opening remarks. It's also where you will find a schedule of upcoming meetings, including the administrative law judge hearings in February. Thank you again. Have a good day.